All right, let's begin. So tonight we're talking about needs analysis and specifically determining KPIs, but there's a series of steps we have to go through in order to do that. First, we're going to talk about the business of sport. How did sport go from this primarily amateur activity to something that we funnel millions and millions of dollars into at multiple levels, right? Professional sport, but also at the governmental level as far as the Olympic Games go, at the university level and throughout academia. How did it become this professional thing that even requires things like sports analytics and KPIs to milk the most performance that we can out of athletes? Of course, that's fun and it's amazing, and that's the whole reason that we're in this program. But I guarantee you 50 years ago, there was no such thing as a sport performance master's program. So we'll talk about that just a little bit. Then we'll look at performance outcomes and how to determine them. Then go on to determining the demands of the sports as well as the determinants of sport performance. And then look at how to develop a performance model. We'll look at the difference between a deterministic model and a dynamical systems theory type of model. We're not going to talk about how to develop one of those because that requires machine learning and somebody way smarter than me to explain it. And then we'll end with determining KPIs. Now, we're not going to go through a specific sport example of KPIs. It will seem open-ended, but if we follow these steps in any sport, then you'll start to arrive at the correct understanding of what KPIs you need to use. But it's going to differ based on the level of sport, whether it's amateur or professional, whether it's junior high, youth, maybe adolescent, high school, college, depending on the individual's history. All of those things will change the KPIs that you determine to be important for the success of your athlete, your team, your organization, and for the specific season that you're in, okay? All right, this first graph, this is showing the relationship between expenses and revenue in the Big 12 over, I think it's about 16 years, 04 to 2020. And you can see the rise not only between lower spending schools and higher spending schools, but also over time as schools spend more and more money. But the thing is, as they earn more money. As they earn more money, they also spend more money. This is the chicken or the egg problem. Do they need more money or do they earn more money? And one drives the other. And so as income rises, budgets also rise as well. And so we get funds for people like sports scientists. Sports science it wasn't really a field until about 10 years ago, or it was, but it wasn't its own defined field. And so now a lot of the bigger schools, the more and more money they throw into sport, the more they realize, hey, like we're going to at some point hit diminishing returns with all of this money that we're throwing at sport. How can we optimize it? And that's where the sports scientist comes in. And that's part of why we determine KPIs. Also, this article published a few years ago, the relationship between spending and winning in collegiate baseball. Okay? And what they found was that expenditures account for 18% of the variance in winning. That's a pretty high percent. If you just spend more, you win more, okay? For every $1 million of additional funding that a university gives to its baseball program, they increase their winning percentage by 5%, and they increase their likelihood of qualifying for a major tournament quite drastically, 248% to the NCAA tournament, and then 127% to the College World Series. So money is pretty important. However, have we all seen this movie? Yes? What's it called? Moneyball. If you haven't seen it, it's your homework this week, on top of all your other homework and reading, to watch this movie. It's a really good sort of Hollywood representation of sport analytics and its importance in sport success, okay? And this is, of course, in baseball. Baseball being known for its data analytics and having a really good history of keeping track of player metrics over time. And so in this film, we have the juxtaposition of sort of the passed on sort of coach's wisdom and that art of coaching and coach's knowledge, which is finite because any coach has just a human brain. They don't have a database for a brain, right? That versus a statistical analysis approach to loading your team full of people who have a statistical probability of getting on base or getting a higher hitting percentage, etc. Okay? So the key point here is that as money is poured into sport, the stakes for winning and losing have risen dramatically. There are a lot more stakeholders okay? A lot more people care. When you start putting money into something, you start caring about it a lot more. This has created a need to look outside of that black box model of training that we talked about a couple sessions ago, where you don't know what's in the training process. And it's led to the rise of sport analytics and sports scientists, okay? And that's why we're even here, determining how to figure out what KPIs to test and monitor. Now, another sector of the economy that has been doing this for a long time is the business sector. And so any data dashboard for athletes, any athlete monitoring dashboard that you see, most likely it had its roots in some sort of a business dashboard, okay? A business analytics dashboard. They're the ones that continue innovating and driving all the innovations with things like Excel and Power BI and these other data visualization software packages. And athlete monitoring is sort of catching up. We're several steps behind. Okay, so how do we set our KPIs, our key performance indicators? Well, the first step is to identify what it takes to succeed. Okay, this is part of the analysis of sport. Performance outcomes. A performance outcome is the desired outcome over a defined period of time at the level of the team or the athlete. Okay, so for example, this could be winning a game. It could be winning a tournament or a championship. It could be achieving a certain time or distance or mass in a centimeter gram second sport, right? That's a sport that you compete in distance, in time, or in weight lifted. But how do we set that performance outcome? Well, we can take a look at performance databases, and these exist. They're open to the public. You can go in and you can look at historical performance outcomes for as long as we've been keeping data in these sports, okay? And here are some examples from the textbook that they list. You can go into there and we could pull all of that data and we could do some really cool statistical analyses on them. And in fact, a lot of researchers have actually done that. For instance, this study by Berthello, I think that's how you pronounce his name, is looking at 400-meter races on the women's side. He looks at a bunch of different athletes, men, women, 400-meter, other distances, running and swimming. And he's using that historical performance data not only to set performance outcomes, right? A coach could look at this, or a track team could look at this and start to set some performance outcomes based on this data. But he's also looking at trying to predict where performance is going in the coming years. And it sort of looks like we're plateauing in performance. We're starting to find the ultimate degree to which humans can perform at the 400 meters, right? Barring any other technical innovation or ways around the doping laws, okay? Which might explain that peak up there before it fell off, right? More stringent doping controls, and then suddenly there's lower performances. And you'll see that occasionally. You'll also see things like in swimming, you might see a spike before they banned those, what were those suits called? The what suits? The full body suits. The full body suits, yeah, they were made of some super material that was like more slippery than your skin in water. Made you float. Yeah. Oh yeah, you were a swimmer,
yeah,
right?
You would just like be on top of the water.
Yeah, you're just like, it turns you into a dolphin, and then, yeah. Okay, here's another graph. This is just showing not even performance, but height and weight in professional athletes in America. So NFL, NBA, NHL, and baseball versus the US population. And we can see that we're really starting to get many standard deviations above the mean of the general US population that we're starting to recruit for these sports. We're getting into these more extreme physiological phenotypes in these elite athletes. Okay, so anyways, these types of performance outcomes databases are great starting points for you to set your performance outcome goals for your teams. And it doesn't always have to be world-class and elite athletes. This exists at every level. Collegiate times, or high school bests, or national bests, or youth bests, okay? These lists are out there. Now, these also exist for professional sports, and even outside of the actual governing body for that sport. So these are some sort of what we call citizen stats pages that these keep metrics and analytics for lots of different sports, okay? And you can check those out on your own time if you'd like as well. Now, when we're establishing these performance outcomes, databases are important, but what happens if a database doesn't exist? Or what happens if, maybe you're coaching a high school team and you're not going to be looking at the the country leader times or the previous championship times. Maybe it's more of a developmental season for you. How do you start to set those performance outcomes? Well, you want to take a systematic approach. And I kind of go the opposite way that the book says. The book says to start with the scientific literature. But if you're working hand in hand with a coach, I don't think you should start with the scientific literature. I think you should start with what that coach already knows. That coach knows a lot. They're an expert in what they're doing. That's why they were hired to do it. So you should start with their own knowledge and historical performance data from the athletes you're working with right now. Then from there, you go to coaching manuals. And from there to the scientific literature. Now, when we're consulting the literature, though, we have to remember that the subjects in that scientific literature, they're all over the place. Sometimes it's elite athletes. Sometimes they're untrained college males, right? And those two groups are vastly different physiologically. They're still humans. They're still both humans. But if we think of that bell curve, right, some of those untrained college males are going to be way on this side of the bell curve, and all of the elite athletes are going to be way on that side of the bell curve for any given trait. Make sense? So we can't always infer from research to the population that we're working with. We have to take that with a grain of salt. And then finally, if no research exists, you might just have to do your own in-house research. That's something that we've been talking about. Keeping good records, keeping longitudinal KPI records or testing data so that you can look back on it, okay? Now, once we've identified what it will take to succeed at your level with your athletes in your sport, the next thing is to define the performance model, okay? So in defining the performance model, we have to figure out, well, what are the determinants of performance? What are the things in this sport that allow me to perform? These are the various factors that dynamically affect performance outcomes in a given sport. And the resultant model that you use, not necessarily for its truthfulness, but more for its usefulness, the resultant model can be either deterministic or dynamic. And what I mean by that is deterministic models, essentially it's like if you do A and then you do B, you will arrive at C. And dynamical systems theory is more like A is continuously interacting with B, which then interacts back with it, and results in C, which feeds back into both A and B. And so it's harder to nail down. Typically, we're not going to come up with a dynamical systems model when we're training athletes. That's less on the applied side of sports science. Okay, and these things can be, these determinants, they're not just physiological. We tend to go there because we're all exercise science majors at one point in undergrad, and that's how we think. But they can be psychological as well. They can be tactical, technical. They can be based on the rules of the sport. The three-point line being moved out a little bit in the NBA. They could be due to rule changes. They can arise from some sort of health-related issue, right? So they are multifactorial. And I kind of just said this. They include all of these things, right? Down to the equipment. What is the biggest innovation in distance running in the last 10 years? Shoes, shoe technology. Most importantly, the carbon plate in the shoes have dramatically increased the performance in all races, 5K and up. Actually, I don't know how much it increases in the 5K, because often they wear spikes. Although now it's kind of 50-50, but definitely the 10K and up, and definitely on all the road races. Okay, so here's an example. This is from the text as well. This is of an 800-meter runner. What we're looking at is only the physiological demands, okay? Just right there in that red box, the physiological demands of the sport. This is not even talking about all the other demands. But this is what you would do. You would chart it out when you're creating this model. This would be more of a deterministic model, not a dynamical systems theory model. All right? Here are some health determinants. So these are essentially injury risks that we would need to identify. And we might arrive at something like this. This is from Saunders et al. This doesn't include all of the factors. This is mostly physiological determinants of performance in a distance runner. But you can see that this requires some thought. It requires not only your existing knowledge, not only those performance outcomes that you hope to achieve, but quite a bit of the physiological underpinnings of that sport. Okay, so we're going to have to consult the primary literature to get that. Now, I mentioned the difference between a deterministic model of training and performance and a dynamical systems theory. A deterministic model, this is a model of sport wherein there is a unique consequent or outcome to every input or state. Like I said, if you do A and B, you will equal C, right? It's just kind of like addition. But dynamical systems theory, this is more like the butterfly effect. Like a butterfly flaps its wings in Montana and there's a tornado in China, or whatever that is. If you guys have read, if you watched the movie, but also if you've read Jurassic Park, who's read the book? Oh my gosh, are you serious? It's such a good piece of real science fiction. There's a lot of dynamical systems theory in it. I read this to my kids last year. They loved it. So Dr. Ian Malcolm talks a lot about chaos theory in the running of Jurassic Park, and he talks about these multiple iterations of random effects that we cannot account for because of the interaction of complex layers of things. Like there's these organisms that make their own choices, and there's systems we put in place to control them, and there's human operators, and there's mistakes, and there's weather, and there's all of these things that we just can't predict. Even if we had all the supercomputing power in the world, it's impossible to predict. And every iteration leads to more and more and more chaos, okay? So he says, he's saying this about the park owners. He says, they believe that prediction was just a function of keeping track of things, right? And we might think that sometimes in sport. If you knew enough, you could predict anything. That's been cherished scientific belief since Newton. And chaos theory, or in our case, dynamical systems theory, throws it right out of the window. Like that's the whole reason why we contest sport. If this wasn't true, then we would just look at who was best on paper and leave it at that. And we wouldn't have to play the game. We wouldn't have to run the race because it would all be settled by prediction. But predictions are not always correct. Okay. Something, however, that's a useful concept for us to remember, but we're probably not going to run our sports program based on dynamical systems theory. Something that's more familiar to us is something like this. It's a little bit more constrained. It's more linear. It's more well-defined. Something like an annual plan. Okay. We remember that this is just a roadmap, not a recipe for success. A recipe you typically follow to the T, and you make sure that you hit each step in order with the exact amounts. This is more like a guideline. It's a roadmap that you could take a detour along the way. If there's a blockage, like on I-5 North, you might skip over to the next freeway and get on the 405 or something, okay? And that's how it is with training. Now, going back to our 800-meter example, that's kind of where the training interventions come in, not as simplified as just listing the types of stimuli that you will be giving. However, that annual plan results in specific training in order to meet those physiological demands. All right, and same thing on the health side. So after we have identified our performance outcomes and defined the performance model, it's time to determine the key performance indicators. What things, when they are measured, would indicate to us that the athlete is performing at the level that we desire them to perform at, or maybe below, okay? What things can help us guide that training process? So the definition of a KPI is a quantifiable measure used to evaluate the success of a team or athlete in meeting a performance objective. This is based on the needs analysis of the sport, the team, and the athlete, as well as the competitive outlook for that season. Examples, they can be skill-based, tactical-based, physiologically based, or psychologically based. All right? We tend, as sports scientists and strength coaches, because of that crossover between them, we tend to focus more on the physical, right here. But somebody like the head sport coach might be thinking more tactical or skill-based. The sports psychologist, if they work with one, would be thinking more psychologically, although sometimes that falls under the purview of the sports scientist as well. It kind of depends on the sport. Again, back to our example. In this case, the KPIs would be VO2 max, running economy, lactate threshold, and velocity at VO2 max for this runner. We know, however, that these are quite fatiguing, most of these tests. These probably wouldn't be monitoring approaches. You're not going to do this daily. Like VO2 max daily would just be highly fatiguing. These would be part of maybe a testing battery administered at specific points in the season, just a couple times. And then we would use other things like HRV or heart rate reserve or heart rate response to exercise or RPE, session RPE, to monitor how the athlete is doing. And similarly with our health-related outcomes for this runner. Although I would probably put lower limb strength and power up with the performance, especially for an 800-meter runner. But yes, it does play an important part in injury prevention. Okay, so when we're thinking of KPIs in the professional sports setting and sports-specific KPIs, we think of, if you turn on ESPN, basically anything that the commentators are going to be talking about when they talk about players. So for baseball, things like batting average or on-base percentage. In football, passing yards, rushing yards, maybe the 40-yard dash if they're talking about the combine, things like that, right? And so a lot of these we're never going to touch as a sports scientist or as a strength and conditioning coach as far as what we do practically with the athletes, unless it's physical in its in nature, like a 40-yard dash or the bench press, et cetera. I mean, of course, things like the bench press, we probably wouldn't use that. Like, it's not the best test, I think, to use to display upper body strength and power for a football athlete. Would you agree, Sam? Yeah, no. You could probably think of a bunch of things that would be better than that. However, it's one that's, of course, often measured because of the combine. So some common fitness characteristic-based KPIs that we would use as sports scientists, and a lot of these we'll learn about in this class, are here in this list. I'm not going to read through all of them. Just know that they cover upper body and lower body. They cover all the fitness characteristics. They cover aerobic and anaerobic capacities. We have to think all-inclusively for sport, but we would only select a few as they are directly related to the sport in question, right? So we're probably not going to test the aerobic capacity of a weightlifter. That should be obvious. We're probably not going to test change of direction ability for a 400-meter runner, although it is really important that you turn left at the right times. Okay? So we've determined the KPIs. The next step in this process is assessing the athlete. And this goes back to this diagram, this athlete monitoring conceptual model, where everything in this blue area, this monitoring, it should say like monitoring/testing in this case. Everything in blue is part of what we do to monitor and test using the KPIs that we've identified. And then finally, using that data, we plan and deploy the program interventions, we assess the data, and then we revise the plan. Okay, so the key point here is that just as we do in business and as we've been doing for a long time, it is important to define KPIs for athletes and teams, and also important for the rest of the sports scientists, or I should say, for the sports scientists and the rest of the support staff to continually monitor the athlete's performance and the entire team's performance using these KPIs. Only an evidence-based approach and collective discussions based on a mixture of data and expertise can be considered as a useful strategy for improving performance. Okay, it's not just the KPIs that are going to drive performance. You have to actually take that data and talk to the coaches about it, talk to the other support staff about it. You have to mix it into what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. Remember, data collection for its own sake does nothing but waste time. Data collection, though, for the sake of altering the training process in some way, or at least confirming your trajectory, that is highly, highly valuable, okay? Now, what I'd like you guys to do is, let's take 5 minutes to do this. I want you to work through each of these steps. I'll go back to the steps. With the person next to you, pick a sport, pick a level of that sport, and then we're gonna walk through each of these steps, or you're gonna walk through each of these steps. We'll take like 5 to 7 minutes to do it. You can look up performance outcomes online in a database if you don't know them already for that team or sport. From there, from performance outcomes, then you'll identify the determinants of performance, okay? Think back to when you studied to take the CSCS and the needs analysis. Then from there, you don't have to determine the entire performance model. That would take a long time. But from there, you can determine some KPIs. You don't need to be all-inclusive, but maybe determine some key KPIs, that's kind of redundant, key performance indicators that you would use, and then we'll share them as a class. Make sense? Okay, ready, go. Dr. Goodin here, back with another lecture.